They seated me at the far end of the table, just close enough to hear the toasts, just far enough to remind me I didn't belong. It was supposed to be a family dinner, but it felt more like a staged erasure. My name was never mentioned. My title, Governor of Colorado, reduced to a muttered "she used to be something." My mother, the great Judge Eleanor Strickland, raised a glass and said, "To the daughter who makes us proud." She looked at my sister, and everyone followed her lead, like they always had. Applause, laughter, eyes that skipped past me like I was just furniture with feelings. I stayed seated. I didn't flinch, not even when my father whispered, "Don't start anything tonight. Not here." But someone else did. Halfway through the evening, the judge who'd presided over my sister's latest judicial award walked in, running late. He scanned the room, and when his eyes landed on me, he stopped. He raised his voice, just enough to carry across crystal glasses and fake smiles. "Welcome back, Governor." The room froze. My mother's smile cracked. My sister looked like she'd swallowed her own spotlight. And in that pause, I realized I wasn't the one who needed to prove I belonged. They were the ones who couldn't admit what they'd tried so hard to bury. I never needed their pride to hold power, just my name, and I had already reclaimed it. I'm Lena Strickland. My family once used the law to silence me. Now I write the laws that silence their excuses. Before I share what really happened that night, and how I got here, I'd love to know you're here with me. Comment listening, or let me know where you're watching from. Sometimes, just knowing someone's on the other side makes it easier to keep speaking. And if this story hits something in you, subscribe. You might be surprised how many people have lived some version of this. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. The dining room was exactly as I remembered. Polished mahogany, stiff-backed chairs, and the lingering scent of rosemary lamb, because nothing said, "We're proud of you," like the same dish served at every family milestone. It was a Saturday evening in mid-October, the Virginia air sharp with the promise of winter. I sat at the far end of the table in my worn cardigan, surrounded by glass cases of law degrees, framed commendations, and portraits of ancestors who had all made their mark in courtrooms, not forests. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a coronation. My older sister Felicity was about to be nominated for a federal judgeship, and the Stricklands had turned out in full regalia. My father, retired Chief Judge Charles Strickland, held court at the head of the table. My mother, Eleanor, Professor Emerita at the university's law school, hovered like a conductor, ensuring every piece of silverware and every line of praise was perfectly placed. I kept quiet, tracing the rim of my glass. No one asked why I was back in town. No one mentioned the report I'd published exposing Armex Energy's violations in rural Texas. Maybe they hadn't seen it. More likely, they had, and chose not to. "Lena," one of Dad's former colleagues boomed down the table. "What are you up to these days? Saving the whales?" Felicity didn't miss a beat. "She works with wind, or trees. Something leafy," she said with a smirk, tipping her glass. Laughter erupted, a low, cultured chuckle from the federal judge beside her. I smiled, tight-lipped. I was used to being the family anecdote, the black sheep in hiking boots. But I tried. God help me, I tried. "I just wrapped up a project in West Texas," I said, forcing my voice above the clinking cutlery. "We brought solar grids to a town that's been off the main power lines since—" My father waved a hand, dismissive. "Tonight's about Felicity. Let's not derail with community gardening." It hit me in the gut, harder than I expected. I nodded, pretending I'd just remembered something funny, laughed softly to myself, swallowed the burn in my throat with a sip of Merlot that suddenly tasted metallic. After dessert, I wandered into the kitchen to escape. That's where Mom found me. She didn't look at me when she handed me the folded slip of paper. Don't bring up controversial things tonight. We've worked too hard for this family's name. And then she walked away, just like that, as if she'd passed me a recipe, not a warning. The final insult came when we gathered for the group photo. One of the professors gestured me over. Let's get the whole family in. My father hesitated. Let's do the traditional one first. I knew what that meant. I stepped back. The camera lens passed over me like I wasn't there. Click. Smile. Done. Later, back in the guest room, I opened my laptop to check messages, just to remind myself I existed somewhere. That's when I saw it. Breaking news. Armex Energy files defamation suit against environmental analyst. I froze. Then I saw the legal counsel's name on the filing. Eleanor Strickland. My own mother. Her signature beneath the accusation that I had falsified data. It wasn't just ridicule anymore. It wasn't being left out of a picture, or being mocked for caring about people without lobbyists. It was Exile, documented, certified, legal. They hadn't just made me invisible. They'd erased me. And I finally understood. I wasn't just the disappointment. I was the liability they had decided to cut loose. 3 days after the family tribunal, I boarded a Greyhound bus under the cover of darkness, heading west. No return ticket. No luggage beyond a canvas duffel. No forwarding address. I'd booked the ride in cash. Used a fake name at the motel. Left my phone in a trash can back in Richmond like it was a cursed object. As the lights of the city faded behind me, I felt strangely calm, like shedding a skin that never fit. In New Mexico, I stepped off the bus at a lonely fuel station that smelled of diesel and distant regret. The sky was impossibly wide. I slipped behind the building where the wind couldn't reach me, pulled out the soft leather-bound notebook I'd carried for over a decade. Inside were handwritten recipes from my mother, neatly folded schedules of family birthdays, acceptance letters to law school I never used, photos of me and Felicity in stiff collars and courtroom heels. I took a breath and lit the edge of a page, watched it curl and blacken before feeding the next. There was a weight to watching history become smoke, but tucked in the back, pressed so tightly I'd nearly missed it, was a torn scrap of paper I didn't recognize at first. The handwriting hit me before the memory did. Tara. College debate team. Seat partner in constitutional ethics. Her note was scrawled like a dare. Don't let them decide who you are. That was the last thing I burned. In Denver, I became L.S. Arlen. The initials were my own, but the name came from 2 places. Sylvia Plath's poem about rebirth and Arlen Street. The first place I landed when the bus wheezed to its final stop. I didn't talk about my past. Didn't make friends. I worked. At first it was dishwashing at a cafe that smelled like cinnamon and bleach, then night shifts cleaning a community health clinic, mopping floors, dumping biohazard bins, folding gowns. No one asked where I went to school. No one cared if I had opinions on Supreme Court rulings. You did the job, or you didn't. For the first time in my life, I wasn't measured by a last name or a GPA. Just by whether the floor was clean or the soup was hot. That kind of clarity was addictive. One night, around 1 a.m., I was taking out trash behind the clinic when I heard raised voices inside. I peeked back in. An elderly woman was panicking over a notice taped to her door. A young nurse was trying to explain it in English. The woman only spoke Spanish. I didn't speak it well, but I recognized the wording on the form. It was an environmental citation, mold contamination, air quality risk. I stepped in. I translated the legalese into gestures, broken Spanish, and simple drawings on a napkin. I told her what she needed to do and where to go, that it wasn't a fine yet, just a warning. Her panic turned into cautious understanding. She held my hands when she left, whispered, "Gracias," over and over. I didn't think anyone noticed, but someone had. 2 days later, Rafael Delgado appeared at the back door with a coffee and a card. He was tall, tired-looking, with calloused hands and a voice like gravel. Said he ran a small nonprofit, Eco-Equity, that fought for land rights and clean water for marginalized communities. He'd seen what I did. Said he needed someone who understood policy but could live outside the spotlight. Someone invisible, but effective. He didn't ask for a resume, just if I wanted in. That night, I folded up my janitor uniform, still smelling faintly of bleach and hand soap, and tucked it into a shoebox. A part of me wanted to cry, but the tears never came. I wasn't sad. I was still, quiet, like the space between waves before they break. I turned off the light and whispered to myself, steady as breath, if I've been erased from the family tree, then I'll grow roots somewhere else. 3 years passed, just like that. Not in peace, not in chaos, just in a kind of quiet, steady rhythm. At Eco-Equity, I became the person people listened to, not because I spoke often, but because when I did, the room paused. They didn't know much about me, and they didn't ask. I was L.S. Arlen, project coordinator, environmental strategist, soft-spoken and razor-focused. My silence wasn't a void, it was armor. In my office above my desk hung a painting of a desert night. Rich indigo skies dotted with ghostly constellations. I had painted it from memory, with Tara's favorite colors. She'd once told me the stars weren't just pretty, they were the only laws untouched by men. No one at the office asked who she was. I never offered. Some stories grow heavier when spoken aloud. Then came the article. It was small, tucked in the corner of a local paper, but sharp enough to draw blood. Eco-Equity, a shelter for failed activists? The headline sneered. They called us fringe, unserious, dangerous even, said our advocacy misled minority communities into believing false promises. I felt the fury creep in like heat under the skin. I drafted a statement, clear, precise, fact-checked. I wanted to push back, to name the truth. But Raphael vetoed it. "We don't give gasoline to sparks," he said. "Let them bark." So I shelved the words and built something else instead. A network. I reached out to every small environmental group I'd ever heard of, ones with no lawyers, no PR, just grit. I started coordinating open workshops, translating zoning laws into everyday language, teaching elders how to read environmental citations, training teens to record air and soil quality. We didn't fight back with noise. We made facts louder than rhetoric. It was in the middle of one of those land reclamation efforts that I hit a wall. We needed to lease a public lot to install rainwater tanks for a reservation outside Durango. Paperwork, of course. Nothing I hadn't done before, until I reached the final signature line. Government forms don't accept aliases. I had to write it. Lena Strickland. The clerk at the counter glanced at the name, then back at me. Strickland? As in Judge Charles Strickland? I held his stare. Not anymore. He didn't press, just nodded and stamped the form. But the crack had formed. I felt it. The name had left my mouth like a ghost that didn't want to be summoned. That night, I stared at my reflection in the window, my face half lit by the street lamp, and I didn't know whether I was mourning or bracing for impact. 2 weeks later, during a community meeting with the Navajo Council, a local journalist was filming for a small documentary series on water rights. It was routine. Some B-roll footage, a few interviews, nothing major. I didn't think twice about it. Until Mark, my assistant, walked into my office mid-meeting, silent and pale. He held out a brown envelope. No return address, no name, Just wait. Inside was a single photograph, our family photo, the one from that night. Felicity's smile flawless, my father's proud, stiff shoulders, my mother's calculating eyes, and me, my face cut out with surgical precision. The paper jagged where my image had been removed. On the back, a single sentence in handwriting I didn't recognize, but somehow felt carved into my spine. People don't disappear, unless they're erased. Star. I stared at it for a long time, not in shock, not in fear, but in recognition. I had been running from the idea of being forgotten, but maybe someone had been working much harder to make sure of it. The morning of the State Environmental Summit, Denver was soaked in golden light, the kind that made the city look cleaner, newer, like it had something to prove. I stood backstage with a badge clipped to my lapel that read L.S. Arlen Eco Equity. It was what I had always used for events, reports, interviews. Safe, controlled, half real. But that morning, one of the coordinators approached, holding a stack of printed programs. "We secured a last-minute donor, major name," she said. "They need legal names on record for sponsorship validation. Is this correct?" She pointed to the draft, L.S. Arlen, and for a second I hesitated. I wanted to nod, to keep the mask in place. But something in me, the same part that had stared down that old photo, the same part that had whispered "not anymore" at a clerk in Durango, rose up. "No," I said. "It's Lena S. Strickland." The words left my mouth like fire, not to burn, but to warm something long frozen. That night, I lay awake, watching headlights streak across my ceiling, imagining what it would mean for that name to re-enter the public record. But by dawn, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. My name wasn't just theirs to define anymore. It belonged to me, too. The conference hall was packed. Environmental leaders, students, journalists, tribal representatives, state officials, all gathered under banners reading, "Shared Responsibility, Shared Future." When I stepped up to the podium, I saw my full name glowing on the screen behind me. For a second, my voice caught. But I anchored myself in breath and memory. I spoke about environmental justice, not as a concept, but as an obligation. About how laws had been used to protect wealth and power, while communities of color were left with contaminated water and broken promises. I quoted from the Declaration of Indigenous Rights. I told the room that accountability was not a threat, but a form of respect. They listened. Really listened. A clip from my speech, specifically the part where I said, "Silence is not neutrality, it's complicity," went viral within hours. News blogs shared it. Students made graphics with my words. Someone looped my closing lines over a time-lapse of desert wildflowers blooming. And then came the calls. The day after, a journalist left a message with our front desk. "Can you confirm whether Lena S. Strickland is the daughter of retired Judge Charles Strickland?" I didn't panic. I didn't hide. I simply replied through our admin, "That's correct." Because the truth was, I wasn't his daughter anymore. Not in any meaningful way. I had severed that bond the night I saw my mother's signature on a lawsuit against me. And yet, that name, Strickland, no longer owned me. It no longer had the power to shrink me. I was standing in it now, tall. Of course, I wasn't the only one reacting. Felicity called our mother. "She used the name," she said, barely masking her fury. "She's not hiding anymore." Eleanor's voice cracked through the receiver like ice snapping. "She's surfaced, and she doesn't intend to go quietly this time." That night, I found another envelope on my desk. No name, no postage. Inside, a photo of EcoEquity's front office with a bold red X drawn over the door. Scrawled in block letters, Don't drag us into your campaign. I stared at it for a long moment. Whoever sent it thought they were issuing a threat. But it only confirmed something I'd begun to understand. My presence disrupted comfort. It unsettled people who built power on silence. That evening, I walked out onto the balcony of our headquarters. The Rockies spread out before me like a stone chorus. The wind curled around my fingers, sharp and real. I don't need their acknowledgement anymore, I whispered to the dusk. They're going to have to reckon with me instead. The headlines didn't surprise me. Federal judge under scrutiny for ties to Armex. Of course it was Felicity. Of course it was a tangled web of campaign donations and personal relationships, wrapped just tight enough to look legal, but loose enough to leak. I stared at the article in silence, scrolling past her press team's denial, past the half-hearted defense, and landed on the phrase, pending ethics hearing in D.C. My coffee had gone cold. I booked the train ticket anyway. I didn't ask for a seat in the courtroom. I didn't notify the press. I arrived alone, with a wide-brimmed black hat pulled low and no badge to scan. My name wasn't on the registry, but I knew exactly where to sit. Last row, aisle seat, just beneath the broken ceiling vent I used to stare at during moot court finals. The room looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just grown. The hearing began like any other. Stiff suits, scripted tones, buzzwords stacked like sandbags. Then came the pause. A familiar voice, deep, precise, broke rhythm. Is that Governor Lena Strickland? Judge Rupert Lane's gaze hovered over the crowd, right at me. The cameras pivoted like a flock of startled birds. A ripple went through the chamber. Felicity turned. Our eyes met. Her expression didn't falter. It shattered. My mother's grip on her leather clutch tightened until her knuckles turned the color of bone. No one spoke. No one clapped. My name rang through the silence like a verdict. I left before the gavel fell. That afternoon, an old video surfaced. I was 23, raw, unpolished, caught mid-argument with a campus journalist who had written a racist editorial about tribal land claims. In the video, I was angry, justifiably. But the edit trimmed context, sharpened tone, and painted me as unhinged. The caption read, "Governor or hypocrite? Explosive footage raises questions." It spread fast. Mark stormed into my office, his phone already out, screen glowing with source tracking. "It's a shell account. Trace the origin to a PAC tied to a law firm. Guess which one?" He didn't have to say it. I already knew. Eleanor Strickland, once my mother, now my opponent. Always 2 steps ahead and never 1 inch close. "I thought I'd grown numb to knives in the back," I said quietly, watching the video loop again. Turns out, it still stings. But this time, I didn't reach for a mic, didn't call a press conference, didn't draft a tweet. I went home. I brewed tea. And I sat with my grief like it was an old friend I no longer feared. Then I opened my journal. 3 lines. Do not respond. Do not correct. Shape truth with law, not with sound. That night, I began writing something I'd been circling for years. A draft policy, a framework, a firewall. Its working title, Legacy Disclosure Act. It would demand transparency for all judicial figures, political candidates, and corporate leaders, requiring them to publicly report any familial or financial ties related to entities they ruled on, partnered with, or benefited from. It wasn't revenge. It was the blueprint for what would come next. And for the first time in a long while, the ghosts in that courtroom, the legacy of my family, the whispers behind my back, didn't feel so powerful. They felt outdated. I wasn't haunted anymore. I was building something they could never bury. The first time I smelled the smoke, I was 40 miles out, windows sealed, vents off, and the car still choked on it. The Four Corners wildfire had already devoured 3,000 acres by the time I arrived. Red haze hung over the land like a bruise. Ash fell like gray snow. And in the middle of it all, the local emergency shelter was overflowing with coughing children, elders with oxygen tanks, and tribal leaders whose patience had run thin. It wasn't just a wildfire. It was a crime scene. Armex claimed it was an act of nature. But nature doesn't leak methyl chloride for weeks into protected land. Nature doesn't cover it up with forged compliance reports and blame dry leaves. I met Tara Begay just past the triage tent. She had soot on her cheek and steel in her eyes. Barely 25, but already sharper than most cabinet staff I'd known. She introduced herself with no frills. "I'm not a nonprofit. I'm not a campaigner. I'm here because this is my home." We hit it off in a way I didn't expect. She had the same fire I once had, before I learned how easily it could burn those around you. She told me her mother had died when Tara was 13, drinking water Armex had secretly contaminated. "I used to dream of lawsuits and sirens," she said. "Now I just want the land to breathe again." I told her something I hadn't said out loud in years. Justice doesn't live in rage, Tara. It survives in patience and precision. You can't outburn a system that's made of ash. Still, I saw myself in her. The way she took every insult personally, the way she charged into every meeting like it was a battlefield. It scared me more than I admitted. A week later, after our largest town hall gathering yet, Tara was found dead on the shoulder of Route 491. Officially, lost control on a sharp turn. Unofficially, I watched the surveillance footage in silence as a black SUV with tinted windows trailed her vehicle from the meeting site. The license plate? Registered to a shell logistics firm out of Albuquerque, fully owned by a subsidiary of Armex. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there, jaw clenched so tight I tasted iron. I kept asking myself, did I bring this down on her? My name had drawn headlines. My presence had drawn cameras. Maybe they saw her standing next to me and decided that was enough. At the funeral, her grandfather took my hand and said, "She believed you could finish what she started. That's not a burden. That's a baton." I nodded, but I wasn't sure I deserved to carry it. 3 days later, a letter arrived at my Denver apartment. The return address was blank. Inside was Felicity's handwriting. Sharp, unfiltered, real. Mi bao chi viet choem. Ba I so. La ne em se hongque, jiao lai nua. Nhung. Chithi hong, viet jashin. Chi viet vi. Chivua biet chuyen vetara. Va chitin em lan jiao tien. Nu em ko the ve, lam on ve. I read it 3 times before folding it neatly and placing it in my desk drawer. The same drawer where I kept Tara's badge, the one she clipped to her windbreaker when she worked cleanups, the one still smeared with smoke. That night, I sat in bed, staring at my laptop. I pulled out the only photo of Tara and me, grinning under a tarp as rain soaked the protest site last spring. I taped it to the back of the screen. Let it face me every time I opened it. Then I composed one message. To no one. To everyone. I won't come back to mend what broke. I won't return to salvage their names or redeem my bloodline. I'll come back for one reason only. So the cycle ends with me. And when I hit send, something cracked in me. Not a break. A fault line shifting into something new. Something deeper. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was war. When I stepped into the house I grew up in, the smell hit me first. Lemon polish on wood floors. Fabric softener on the living room throws. It was as if the house hadn't noticed I'd been gone. The photo of Felicity still hung in its frame above the fireplace. Her graduation robe pressed, her smile poised. My photo, once next to hers, was gone. Not replaced. just erased. We didn't speak much during dinner. My father asked about the flight, not the firestorms or the legislation. My mother moved food around her plate like a bored surgeon. Only Felicity watched me like I might break something if left unsupervised. Later that night, in her room, our old room, though hers was now remodeled in soft pastels and minimalist decor, she poured 2 glasses of something sharp and amber. She didn't hand me one, just set it near me and sat down. Then she began. "Mom took money," she said, straight out, like she'd been rehearsing it for years. "Hundreds of thousands, not donations, payments, from a research fund linked to Armex. I didn't move. She also drafted the legal framework for the petition against you, let one of her associates sign it, said it would protect the firm's image. I felt something cold press against the base of my spine. "And Dad?" I asked. Felicity nodded slowly. "He knew," said. "The law can't beat family tradition." It wasn't fury I felt. It was clarity. Like watching a fog burn off after years of walking blind. The trial that broke me wasn't an accident or the result of legal divergence. It was strategy. It was betrayal wrapped in professional polish. Felicity sat back, glass untouched. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," she said. "I came to ask for help." I waited. "They're building a case against Mom. Quietly, for now. But if it leaks to the press, she's done. We're done. I need you to slow it down." "No." I didn't even flinch when I said it. "Please, just your name." A whisper to the right office. Not even a statement. Just a pause. I looked at her. Really looked. The fierce older sister I once admired was no longer standing tall. She was slumped beneath the weight of all she'd inherited and all she couldn't fix. I thought of Tara. I thought of Mark. I thought of how justice delayed had already cost too much. I said nothing, just stared. When I stood to leave, Felicity reached under her desk and pulled out a wooden box. Inside was a small USB drive. She didn't explain. "These are Mom's off-ledger accounts. All of it. If you're going to burn it all down, let me tell Dad myself." I nodded once, then walked out the front door without turning back. No hugs, no tears, no dramatic declarations. I wasn't leaving home. I was exiting a crime scene that wore the perfume of nostalgia. The next morning, back in Colorado, I entered the office early. The air still held the bite of dawn. I sat at my desk, flipped open my laptop, and began drafting the first line of the bill that would soon rattle every foundation they built their names on. A nation cannot call itself just if it permits bloodlines to outweigh the rule of law. I stood outside the cabinet room like a soldier before battle. No cameras, no press badges, no live stream. Just one woman with a folder, a voice, and a law that didn't exist yet, but would, if I had anything to say about it. Inside, the members of Colorado's Executive Council sat in their high-backed chairs, murmuring, shifting, checking watches. I took my place at the head of the table, unfolded the draft, and let the silence breathe before I began. "The Legacy Disclosure Act," I said, "requires every elected official, candidate, and appointee to disclose 3 things: financial ties to family members, litigation history with indirect family involvement, and any conflict of interest caused by blood-related influence." They shifted more. "This isn't about shaming anyone," I added. "It's about safeguarding public trust from private loyalty." A beat passed. Then the Secretary of Commerce stood. "This is an attack on family," he snapped. "You're legalizing betrayal. No law should force a daughter to expose her father." I didn't reply. Instead, I clicked play on a video clip, a mother from the Navajo Nation, filmed days after the fires. If laws only protect the rich and their cousins, she said, voice raw, and not the people breathing ash, then your laws are curses, not constitutions. Silence thickened the air. Later that day, I got a call. Not from a news outlet, not from a supporter. A legislative aide, trusted, discreet, spoke fast and low. He knows you have Eleanor's files. If you move forward, they'll release a statement. About Mark. My chest locked up. They'll say he wasn't killed in the fire, that he was under investigation, that your office covered it up. A threat. In the old language of power. I didn't respond immediately, but 20 minutes later I called back. Left a message. I'm not releasing this for revenge. I'm doing it so no one else has to bleed for secrets. If you want to slander a dead man, do it. But remember, I carry his scars too, and I'm still standing. The bill passed unanimously. I never said my mother's name. I never mentioned Felicity. I didn't recount lawsuits, betrayals, or barbed wire dinner tables. I closed the session with one sentence. I didn't write this to disgrace bloodlines. I wrote it to remind us that justice doesn't require kin, only courage. As I stepped into the hallway, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Calls from reporters, allies, enemies. I let it vibrate in my hand. Then I noticed a plain envelope slipped under my door. 3 lines, handwritten. I can't say sorry, but I read your law. And for once, I think silence is the only thing I have left to give. Signed, Eleanor Strickland. I folded the letter and slipped it into my coat. I didn't smile. I just stood tall, like the law I'd carved out of everything they once tried to bury me with. 3 days after the Legacy Disclosure Act passed, the tremors began. Not earthquakes, not smoke from fires, but something quieter, heavier. Headlines shifted. Campaigns faltered. Pundits paused mid-sentence. A front-page piece in the Washington Chronicle read, "The law didn't name anyone, but everyone knew they were called." It was a strange kind of reckoning, silent but sharp, like the snap of dry wood in a cold room. Then, out of nowhere, a voicemail from Felicity. No begging, no politics, just her voice, tired, unadorned. "When we were kids," she said, "you once asked me why I always interrupted you. I didn't know then. Maybe I was afraid that if I let you speak, I'd have to listen. Well, I've heard you now. Thank you for speaking up for both of us." I played that message 3 times before deleting it. Not out of anger, just because I wanted it to live in memory, not in a file. A week later, an envelope from D.C. arrived on my desk. No seal, just a single sheet of letterhead from a coalition of independent federal lawmakers. They were hosting a summit. When family is the system, and you still choose justice. They wanted me to speak. At first, I declined. I had nothing left to prove, and even less I wanted to repeat. But that night, I found myself staring at the only photo I still kept on my nightstand. Tara and me, shoulder to shoulder in the ash-covered fields. She had hope in her eyes. I had a clipboard. We were both trying to change something. I changed my mind. When I arrived at the summit, I kept my head low. The room was full of people who had survived laws, families, and sometimes both. As I stepped onto the stage, I scanned the audience and froze. Back row, gray suit, no name tag, no aide beside him. Charles Strickland, my father. He didn't smile, didn't flinch. But, for the first time, he didn't look away. I didn't mention my mother or Felicity. I didn't invoke Tara by name. I said, family can be where we learn to love, or where we learn to stay silent. I chose not to be silent anymore. Not so that others would be punished, but so no one else would have to choose between blood and truth. And if this law hurts anyone, maybe that's how we know it was necessary. There was no standing ovation, no camera flashes, just a deep, resonant stillness. The kind that says, "We heard you," even if we don't know what to say back. I left through the side exit. No entourage, just the whisper of soft rain and my heels on the concrete. Charles was standing by the back steps, drenched, no umbrella. He didn't reach for me, just said, "I don't understand you. Maybe I never will. But today, I saw you. Not by your title, by your work." I didn't hug him, didn't forgive him, just nodded, deep enough not to bow. 1 month later, I disappeared from the headlines. I declined every interview, every panel, every exploratory conversation about a federal run. I didn't want a bigger office. I wanted quiet. I retreated to a modest cabin near Grand Lake, once used as a coordination point during the fire relief efforts. No staff, no schedule, just me, the trees, and a desk with uneven legs. I wrote, but not laws, not speeches. I wrote what I called a living testament. Something for whoever came after me, not just in title, but in courage. A letter to the future, signed in full humanity, not just office. One morning, a plain envelope sat on the wooden table out front. No stamp, no name. Inside, a photo. Me and Tara, from our first day at the fire site. And a single line in handwritten ink. She didn't die for nothing. There was no signature, but I knew. Later that week, another package arrived. This one from Felicity. Wrapped in silk, no card. Inside, my old school journal. On the first page, in a 13-year-old's careful handwriting. One day I want to be heard, not loud, just true. I smiled, not broadly, but with warmth. It felt like a circle had quietly closed, even as the world kept spinning. Then, one last voice message, this time from my mother. "Lena, I don't know what to say. When the law you wrote makes me feel ashamed, not because it's wrong, because it's right. I can't fight it anymore, but I hope you won't stop." She didn't say goodbye. She didn't say she loved me. But sometimes, truth comes dry, and still sincere. I returned to the governor's office just once after that. Walking down the hallway, I noticed a painting gifted by a group of indigenous youth, an image of the forest blooming again after the fires. Next to it, mounted in glass, was a legislative award with my name etched in gold. I quietly took it down, hung the painting in its place. When my assistant asked why, I said simply, "I want people to remember what we healed, not just what I was praised for." That evening, up on the rooftop of the state building, I stood in the fading light. No cameras, no sound bites. Just a breeze soft enough to stir the flag. A young reporter, still new, must have followed by mistake. She asked, a little breathless, "Governor, if you could say one thing to someone who's been rejected by their own family, what would it be?" I looked straight at her lens. No flash, no lights. And I said, "Don't wait for them to understand you. Live in a way where you no longer need their understanding, but still keep your heart soft." Sometimes the hardest battles are not fought in courtrooms or behind podiums, but within the quiet choice to stay true, when silence would have been safer. Justice in the end isn't about being right. It's about being real. And when the world tells you to sit down, sometimes the bravest thing is to stand anyway. If this story meant something to you, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to follow or subscribe. Your voice helps keep stories like this alive. Thank you.